I'm Ben Gitty Baker. Today we're going to be showing you how to assemble our cigar box amplifier kit. This is the Oliva G kit, product number 52-00302. And we're going to start with identifying all of the parts that make up this kit so you'll know what you're working with. So here are the parts that come in your CB Gitty cigar box amplifier Oliva G kit, product number 52-00302. You have the Oliva G all-wood cigar box here. You have a couple of feet of extra hookup wire, just so you have some more flexibility on where things go inside the box. You have the amplifier board with the pre-wired leads, all of them labeled so you know what to connect them to. And this is also the volume and on-off control power switch for the amp. We have the mono out or input jack where you plug the amp cord in. This is a 1/4 inch mono jack. We have a set of 8 nickel-plated box corners with matching mounting screws, the power indicator LED, a 9-volt battery holder clip to keep the battery secure inside the box, a black plastic volume knob. We have 4 rubber feet that go on the bottom of the box to keep it from scratching a tabletop and to help keep it secure. We have the 3-inch 4-watt 8-ohm speaker, which is the main noisemaker of the amplifier. And then we have the speaker grill and mounting hardware, 4 832 3/4 inch long flathead machine screws with matching nuts, and then decorative finish washers, nickel plated, to help make that machine screw head look better on the front of the box. And finally we have this black aluminum speaker grill that goes inside the box over the speaker to help protect it and to make the whole thing look better. So that should be the complete set of parts and hardware that came with your kit. I would recommend getting it all laid out. It doesn't have to be just like this, but get it all laid out, verify you have it, comparing to the printed instructions before we proceed on to the steps of assembling the amplifier. So now that you have all of your parts laid out and you're ready to start, the first thing that you really want to do is take a look at your cigar box that came with the kit. You can see it as it's made, it's taller, or at least the designs indicate that it's taller than it is wide. So a lot of times you'll build an amplifier from it that will stand up like this, but you can just as easily build one on its side. Really the speaker can go on any of the panels of the box, although as we'll see when we get into speaker placement in just a moment, there are some places where it tends to work better than others. What we're going to do in this video is show you what we would consider the standard build. We're going to place the speaker in the upper center part of the front panel that opens. We're going to put the amp board so that the volume and power control is here on the side. And we're going to use the basic things that come with the kit here to show you how we would do it. Now you can tweak that and get crazy and creative as much as you want, but we're showing you the basic build. Okay, so the first thing that we do is take our speaker, and this is a 3-inch speaker, and we just kind of place it on top of the box, like so, and just kind of center it and figure out where we're going to want it to go. Now, as I said earlier, for this video and for this how-to, we're going to do what we consider a standard or a basic build. We're going to put the speaker in the center of the front panel about 2/3 of the way up. So here's a close-up of positioning the speaker and marking the mounting holes on the front of your box. So you can measure it if you want. I'm just kind of going to eyeball it here to make sure that there's about the same amount of space on both sides of the speaker. And the exact placement this way doesn't matter too awful much. Generally about 2/3 up the face of the cigar box. So now I'm going to hold the speaker as securely as I can and use a scratch awl. You can also use a pencil if you want something a little less permanent. Using a scratch awl, I'm going to make a divot in the center of each of these speaker mounting holes. like that. So that when I take the speaker away, I have my divots in the front of the box, and that we'll be using those in the next few steps. Now that you have your speaker mounting holes marked, what you should do is take a straight edge and put it diagonally across two of the holes. And you don't have to draw all the way from one hole to another, but kind of right in the middle, make a mark with a pencil on the box. And then turn it the other way for the other two holes, and do the same thing. Now, where these two lines cross, right here in the middle, should be the exact center of these mounting holes. I'm going to take my scratch awl and make a divot there. So we're going to be using a hole saw when we drill out our speaker opening, a 2 3/4 inch hole saw. And the centering drill bit in that hole saw is going to go right here, so that the resulting hole is right in the center. Now, if you're going to be, say, tracing the mouth of a cup or finding some other way to make a circle, you won't really need to do this centering part. All you'll really need to do is kind of eyeball it and get your round tracing pattern right in the middle, and then draw around it to make your circle. And then if you're going to be using a keyhole saw or whatever other method to cut out your circle opening, that should work fine. So this centering is if you're going to be using a drill-based hole saw to cut that out. Alright, now we have our speaker opening marked. Now it's time to figure out where some of the other components are going to go, so that when we head out into the workshop we can do all of our drilling and everything on the box at the same time, get that out of the way, and then come back in here and put it together. So basically we've marked our screw mounting holes and the speaker cutout opening. There are a few other things that will need holes drilled in the box. Basically 3 other things here. One is the input jack. This is where you plug the amp cord in that comes from your guitar or whatever else you're plugging in here. The second is the power indicator LED, and we'll be giving you the exact drill bit sizes that we use for all of these components once we get out to the shop. And then the third item is the mounting potentiometer on-off switch volume control on the amp board itself. We have to drill a hole somewhere on here for this to go. Now for this, what we would consider a standard model, we're going to mount the amp board and the on-off volume control over here on the right side. Based, compared to the front, this would be the right side. We're going to go about 2/3 of the way up, or a little 3/4 of the way up in the center and mount that. We're going to mount the LED kind of in the top center above where the speaker opening will be. And then the input jack we are also going to mount on what would be the right side if you're looking at the front of the box, down towards the bottom. I always find that mounting the input jack lower on the box makes it easier or less likely when you have the amp cord plugged in for it to want to pull the amp over. If you mount the input jack up here on top, while it's convenient to get to, any side-to-side tension on that amp cord is going to want to pull the amp over. And that's also an argument for orienting the amplifier like this, so that it's a little more stable and less tippy. But that's up to you. So, as I said, I'm going to mount the shaft of the potentiometer on the amp board up here towards the top of the box. So I'm just going to measure. These boxes tend to be about 4 inches deep from front to back. This one is 3 7/8, so I'm just going to divide that in half. Should be 1 15/16. I'm going to make a divot there, and then lower on the same side, also at about the halfway point, 1 15/16. I'm going to make a divot for mounting the jack. And then finally on the front, right in the center, I'm going to make a divot by this dimension, the box is about 4 1/4 inches wide, so 2 1/8 inches would be about the middle of that front panel. Now, the only thing to really keep in mind when you're figuring out where you're going to put your components is it doesn't hurt to open up the box and look inside and compare where you want to put it with where things are inside the box, because you wouldn't want to have, say, your input jack right down here at the bottom, because there won't be room for it with this bottom panel. The other thing to think about is once your speaker is mounted in there, you don't want the back of the amp board, which extends into the box about 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch, you don't want that to hit the back of the speaker. So think ahead a little bit to where things will go once you start assembling the parts, and just be careful to leave enough room around everything so nothing's banging into itself or other parts. The only other item that we have to really worry about mounting inside the box is the speaker holder. We don't really have to pre-drill for it. Generally, you'll want the battery holder. Generally, you'll want it towards the bottom of the box. I always like to kind of have it on the bottom panel so the battery is sitting there and there's not really that many places it can go. But we'll be doing that later. So now we have all of our drill points and hole points marked out on the box. We're going to head out into the workshop now and cut our speaker opening, drill all of our holes, and we'll be showing you, as part of that footage, we'll be showing you the drill bit sizes that we're using for each one. So let's head out to the shop. From the workshop, and we have our freshly drilled cigar box. At this point, we're going to do a little bit of cleanup on it, and then we're going to start installing components and taking a look at the next steps. So the first thing that I recommend doing is a little bit of light sanding of the speaker hole. Because the grill mounts inside the box, this outer edge, the cut edge of the speaker hole, is visible on the finished amp. So generally you want to clean that up a little bit. So I'm just going to lightly sand the inner surface, and be careful not to sand the outer surface too much, because that color will sand off a little bit and then it'll be pretty evident that somebody did some careless sanding. You can do a little bit of very light sanding of the actual edge just to get off any burrs and fuzzies. The decorative washers that you'll be putting on will cover the fuzzies that are around the mounting holes, so you don't have to worry about that. And then generally I clean up the inside edge a little bit. Since it won't be visible, you don't have to be as careful. And it doesn't hurt to clean up the inner edges of the other holes you drilled either, just so everything mounts nice and clean and flush. Now, as I said before, this cut edge of the speaker hole is going to be visible. There won't be anything covering it. So what I like to do, because we're using a black speaker grill in there, I like to take a large black permanent marker and very carefully mark the inside edge of this speaker hole so that it doesn't stand out quite so much as being a fresh cut wooden, edge. Now you got to be careful with this because, as I said, the front of the box is visible, and if you slip or get carried away, suddenly you're going to have a big black mark on the front of your cigar box. So this is definitely an optional step. You could just as easily use some kind of wood stain, Danish oil, but I would test carefully to see how much your stain actually stains the front of the box as well. But you can just as easily leave this cut edge as the natural wood. Doesn't hurt anything. Just my personal preference is to cover it up, darken it down. Make everything a little more uniform. Nicely, like so. So now you should be able to, now that you've drilled all those holes, you should be able to lay your speaker on there, and the mounting holes you drilled should match up with the holes in the plate of the speaker. If they don't, you're in a bit of trouble because at this point you can't undrill and can't uncut this box lid. So if you kind of put the speaker in there and then look at it, you should see that the rings on the speaker, kind of center those in the hole. You should have enough room. If it's off a little bit, it really doesn't matter all that much because you do have this screen grill here that is going to go on and cover that up. So it shouldn't matter too much which way you mount this screen grill, but definitely find the way that it fits in there best. The one thing that you want to avoid is having it overlap this edge, because then the box lid won't shut. So you get that on there, you can get your speaker on there, and you should really start to be able to see at this point how that speaker is going to mount in there. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and mount the speaker in there. We're going to be doing our soldering of the parts in just a moment. You could certainly solder everything first. I like to get some of the components mounted in the box and do the actual soldering in the box for some of them, not all of them. It's easier to get the jack soldered before you mount it in the box. I find it's easier to solder the LED after it's in the box. So I'm going to go through it the way that I would do it here. You can change the order if you want. It's entirely up to you. So first, I'm going to mount the speaker. And the way we mount the speaker is we take one of the machine screws, put it through the decorative washer, bring it through the front of the box, and then having previously determined which way to mount our screen in there so that it doesn't overlap any of the edges, we let's try this way. So we put the screen, then the speaker, and then one of the nuts on the back. And at this point, just finger tight is fine. Then we'll take another set of them. Remember, screw, decorative washer, through the box lid, then the screen, then the speaker plate, and finally put on the nut. And again, finger tight at this point, so it's a little wiggly, so you can adjust it if need be. Then we're just going to do that 2 more times to get the speaker firmly mounted to the box front. So now I have all 4 of the speaker mounting machine screws through there. At this point, it's a good idea to make sure your box still shuts, that this grill isn't overhanging. Looks like we did all right. Now at this point, you don't have to tighten down the screws, but since I'm pretty certain that everything's where it needs to be, at this point I'm just holding the nut on the back with my fingers and turning the machine screw. There's really no huge need to crank it down too awful tight. The decorative washer will start to bite into the wood, and the speaker grill mounting plate will actually start to bend. So just get it good and snug. On this build, we're actually going to be putting a little dollop of hot glue over these nuts a little bit later to help make sure they stay in place. Another thing you might want to do is before you start tightening the nuts too much, just kind of make sure, try to push the decorative washer out away from the speaker opening. It can just kind of help make sure if you've got a little bit of overlap, it can try to mitigate that a little bit. Tighten all 4 of these down. Like that. Okay, so now I can stick the LED in its little plastic mounting bezel through this 1/4-inch hole I drilled in the front. It should be fairly snug, and if you have trouble getting it in there, you can actually pull the LED out of this bezel. Push that black plastic bezel in first, and then while holding it in place with your finger, you can try to work the LED in, kind of hold it in place with your fingernails and work it in there. But I find that usually with 1/4-inch hole, pre-insert the LED into the bezel and then just kind of work it into the position using your thumbnails like that. Now at this point, we have the speaker and the LED mounted. Because the amp board comes pre-wired with these 1-foot leads already wired on, and because they are labeled speaker, input, battery, and LED indicator, I find that mounting the amp board now works just as well as later, because these leads are long enough to reach all of the other components. So I take the nut and washer off the shaft of the pot on the amp board, and put it through the side wall. Now it's the side wall of the box is right on kind of the edge of how wide or how thick of a panel this pot shaft can get through. So it you might find, because those box panels vary a little bit, you might find that you need to take a file or a rasp of some sort and thin down this inner wall a little bit. Sometimes we have to do that on the ones we build. Certainly sanding off any of the fuzzies left over from drilling doesn't hurt. But I think I've got just enough threads on there to get my nut started, and you'll keep the washer. It is good to keep the washer on there just so everything's a little more stable. Now the way that you mount this inside the box doesn't matter too awful much, but I will say that before you mount it in there, there's this little blue, it's actually a trim potentiometer on the amp board, and this is the gain control. And because it's not all that easy to get at once it's in the box, I recommend taking a fine tip screwdriver, a little finer than this one would be preferred, and turning it all the way to the right. That turns the gain all the way up, and make sure you'll get as much sound as possible from your amplifier once it's done. Once it hits the point where it stops, don't overturn it or it'll break. Okay, now we're going to mount the amp board in the side wall of our amplifier. I recommend mounting it so that all of the leads are pointing up towards you instead of the other way. Just gives you a little more slack to work with. Okay, so we've got right through our hole that we drilled. Start the nut. Now I'm going to use an adjustable crescent wrench here to tighten this nut down. You can of course use a properly sized wrench if you want. I'm going to tighten it down till it's fairly snug, until I can see the washer really start to inset into the wood a little bit, because you want this one to be pretty secure on there. Now with these amp boards, be careful while assembling and even afterwards. Don't expose this, the turning part of this on-off volume control. Don't expose that to a lot of shock or a lot of sideways pressure or downward pressure or pulling pressure, because potentiometers can only put up with so much, and it will break and either stop turning or stop turning off. All sorts of stuff can happen. Okay, so now our amp board is installed inside our box. At this point I'm just going to tuck all of the wires in and make sure it still shuts all the way. We've had more than one occasion in building custom one-off amps here where you'll think you have an awesome design and layout, and you go to shut the box and the speaker's hitting the amp board, or the jack's in the way, or all sorts of stuff. So it's always good as you go along, and ideally before you start drilling holes, to make sure your layout's going to work. Alright, so here we are at the soldering station, and I've got my input jack lead here coming off the amp board, and the leads have a little bit of the wire bared, but I'm just going to make that a little bit longer so we have a little more to work with, and then twist it up. I really like to use a set of needle nose pliers to kind of put a little bit of a hook on the end of each one. Now on these input jacks there are two lugs, solder lugs coming off the back. The shorter of the two is the ground, and the shorter one here that connects to this center part that touches the sleeve of the plug is the ground, and the longer of the two, which if you look carefully in this sandwiched material here, comes out and attaches to this prong that touches the tip of the plug, that's the positive. So short negative, long positive. And of course on our leads, black is always ground or negative and red is positive. So I'm going to use our helping hand thing here, which if you're going to be doing much soldering, this is a very handy tool to have. I'm going to put the input jack in it, bring everything a little closer. I'm going to hook this ground wire over the ground lug, pull in a piece of solder and my soldering iron, and touch the tip of the soldering iron to it, melt some solder, and you should see it kind of flow over the lug and over the wire that you have stuck in there. The next one I'm going to do is our speaker. Shouldn't need the helping hands for this. So I mounted the speaker such that the two solder lugs are kind of up at the top to make it a little easier to demonstrate. It honestly doesn't really matter what side they're on. So I'm going to lengthen the bare part of my leads a little bit, twist them, and then put a little hook in there to help them stay in place. And the speaker lugs, if you look closely, one has a little minus sign, one has a positive sign. Of course that's positive and negative. Red goes to the plus, and black goes to the minus or ground. And I always like to kind of bend the little hook in my wire so that it holds them in place, so that my hands are free for holding the soldering iron and the solder. So I'm going to get that positive lead soldered on, get my negative lead soldered on, and the speaker is done. So as far as components to be soldered, that just leaves the LED indicator. And this is the LED turns on when the amp is powered up and turns off when it's powered down. It's a good way to help you remember that it's on, so you avoid unexpected battery drain. Okay, now on the LED has two wire leads coming off the back. One is slightly longer than the other. The longer one is the positive and the shorter one is the negative, or the ground. And it's very important that you get them wired correctly, because if it's wired backwards it will not light up. So what I like to do is using a pair of nippers. Start with the, doesn't matter which you start with, just remember which one it is. So I'm going to start with the negative. I'm going to trim it shorter so that it's about a 1/2 inch long. Then using my needle nose pliers, I'm going to bend a hook into the end so that when I bring my lead around, I can hook the lead hook inside that hook, and using my needle nose pliers, I can kind of crimp both of them shut. That holds everything in place so that my hands are free to then come in, touch the tip of the soldering iron, melt a little solder, let it set up, and it's on there. Now the same thing with the positive. I trim it a little shorter. And the main reason I trim it shorter is so that you don't have a bunch of extra metal in there just kind of floating around that can lead to shorts and all sorts of problems. So bend a hook into the positive, take my lead, kind of join the hooks together, and if you pull too much on it, your hook will bend out. So then use my needle nose pliers and crimp them, and then a little bit of solder like so. Let that set up, test my connection. Yep, everything looks good. So now I have my speaker, my LED, input jack all soldered up. At this point, before you think about closing that box up, we always like to do a test, and we'll do that here in a moment. Alright, so now it's time to test this amplifier that we just soldered up. I've got a 9-volt battery here, and I take the battery connector clip on its lead. I plug that in, or get that connected to the battery, and then I turn on the amp. Now you can see that the LED is lighting up. That's a good sign. And at this point, you should be able to hear a little bit of a hum out of the speaker if you put your ear up close to it. Now I actually have this plugged into the input jack here, a mono amp cable, the other side of which is attached to a cigar box guitar. So when I give this a strum, we should hear something. And we do. So I think everything is wired up correctly. The amp's ready to go. We can take it to the bench for final assembly. Alright, so here we are back at the workbench. We have our freshly soldered amp circuit in here, everything attached. So it's time to begin the final assembly process to finish this amplifier off. For this step, I have brought in a power driver with a #1 fine tip Phillips bit, just to take some of the tedium out of putting in a lot of small screws. You can certainly use a fine tipped hand screwdriver if you want. The first thing we're going to install is the battery clip. Now this could be, depending on how you feel about the soldering and how hard that was, this is one of the trickier bits of assembly of the whole thing, because you've got to get 2 small screws in through these 2 holes in the clip inside the box. It's not the most fun part, but it certainly is possible. So you'll want to mount it 3/4 of an inch or so in, so that the end of the battery has some room. Using my scratch awl and just kind of holding it in place, I start a hole and then take one of the small mounting screws. I actually get the Phillips bit into the screw, holding it in place, apply some pressure, and it's in. Unfortunately, that was the easy one. Now the one that's the second hole, which is further down, I'm going to start kind of at an angle with my scratch awl. Take my screwdriver, put it on, kind of hold it in place with my index finger into the hole. And I know you can't see it at this angle. Be careful not to over tighten. I put it in. So now the battery can sit there once it's on the battery clip and not be in the way. The door should be able to shut all the way and all should be well. So that's out of the way. Now we can install the input jack. And to do that, you basically take the nut and washer off, push it through the hole that we drilled in the side of the box. And again, these are long shaft jacks that we include with this kit. You shouldn't have to thin down the inside of the box panel to get it through. If you do, it'd be the same that you may have had to do for the amp pot. Just use a rasp or a file to take a 1/16 of an inch or so off of the inside wood, and that will thin it down enough so that shaft can come through. I'm going to use my crescent wrench here to snug up the nut on this jack, being careful not to mar the surface of the box as I do, which with this type of wrench it's really easy to slip and put a big old gouge in your box. Alright, so now it's time to do the last things that we need to do inside the box, because once we get these box corners on, the front ones at least will have to be removed to be able to get inside the box. Now, a side effect of this is that to change the battery, you have to take out some small screws to open it up. A potential upgrade or way to avoid that is we sell a 9-volt battery tray which mounts from the outside of the box, and it has a little tray that slides out. You put the 9-volt battery in, slide it back in. Upgrading to that would eliminate the need to open the box to change the battery. So that's something to think about, maybe on your next amp. Or you can just skip using the box corners altogether, use those on some other project, Cigar box guitar, whatever. We're going to show you putting them on. We include them with the kit because they kind of dress up the outside of the box, but there is that trade-off of having to remove the screws to open the box and change the battery. Another thing you could do, if you have the hole saw that you used on the front, cut another hole on the back, maybe cover it with a little hinged panel or something. All sorts of options you can do to be able to get at that battery without having to remove your box corners. But we leave that up to you. Alright, now in preparation to sealing up the box, I'm going to make my final steps in there. I'm going to attach the battery and clip it into place in my battery clip here so that that's held snugly inside the box. I'm then going to take a hot glue gun, and this step is entirely optional, but I like to put a little hot glue over the back of the LED there. Just kind of glob it in a little bit, both to help the LED stay in place and to help insulate those leads a little bit. Now, make sure before you do this, I like to push the leads apart so that they're kind of spread eagle, so there's no chance of them touching. Just make sure that you don't have it touching the speaker grill. You don't want anything metal touching, especially the positive leg of the LED. I also like to put a little hot glue, and again this is optional, but I like to put just a bit on the threads of the speaker mounting screws and on that nut, just as a little bit of safety to keep them from vibrating loose. That little bit of hot glue on there will keep them nice and tight. Okay, so that's the hot glue. We got our battery in there. I am now going to close the box, and it's time to start putting on box corners. As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately the box corners being on there mean that you have to remove the top 4 to be able to open the box to get to the battery. That's just part of the deal. And you can skip the box corners if you want. You don't have to put them on. You can get one of our battery trays. You can cut an access panel to be able to get at the battery. All sorts of options. For this demonstration, because the kit includes them, I'm going to put on the box corners. One thing before we start, the box corner, the point of the corner in there has a little bit of a curve or a radius to it, and that can make it not want to sit completely flush against a sharp corner point. So if you have a file or some sandpaper, I recommend just take the very point of that corner off, and then the box corner will sit a lot more flush against it. Alright, so now we're installing the corners. I've got all of my points filed off so they'll fit snugly. You can either install them so that the face of the corner points forward, or you can do, kind of a decorative sideways deal. So I'm going to just start installing these corners and we'll do a fast forward montage, because this is, unfortunately, one of the more tedious parts of the whole thing, because there's 2 screws per corner. Alright, all of the corners are installed now, so that leaves 2 more things. We're going to put on our on-off volume knob, and finally the rubber bumpers that go on the bottom of the amp, and then we're going to be done. The knobs that we include with these have a small set screw, so you want a small standard screwdriver. Make sure the amp is turned off, and it's up to you where the indicator line should start. Generally we start it at what might be considered an off or a low position there. Get it on. You don't want to hold it in too awful tight because it has to be able to turn. So get it kind of where you want it, and then tighten that set screw. Don't over tighten it, just nice and snug. So now we've got a volume knob on there. Finally, we take our rubber bumpers, and these are just stick on. You peel them off and kind of stick them on there, nestling them up against the corners if you used corners. If you didn't, they can go right out kind of at the corner points of the cigar box. And that is it. You now have a completed, fully functional cigar box amplifier, and you've got your battery in there so you can crank it up. Find your favorite guitar, be it homemade or store-bought. Plug in your cord there, you got everything turned all the way up, and go to town. Is the complete how-to video for assembling the CB Gitty Cigar Box Guitar Oliva G Amplifier Kit, product number 52000302. Thank you.